You of our amazing organizers. Thank you so much for that. And I'm terrible because this is a new talk. So this is the first time I've given this to anyone other than my plants at home, and they don't listen to me anyhow. So you need my notes to get through this one the first time. So I am Mandi. I'm a DevOps advocate of PagerDuty. That means most of the time I don't actually talk about our product. I talk about all the other stuff that people need to be able to use our product better, along with all the other things that they're using and all the kind of stuff that Nathan just talked about. If you'd like to get in touch with me, I'm LNXCHK on most of the social medias out there. If you're old school, you want to email me, I'm mwalls@pagerduty.com. Happy to chat about stuff wherever. If you want to partner with us and do an integration, happy to talk about that as well. That'd be great. So I'm going to talk about culture and what is culture, right? And thinking about organizational culture in particular, right? Because culture is sort of everywhere. It's how humans exist in a society. And when you think about organizational culture, think about, like, you talk to your friends, you're like, hey, what's it like working at, big company X? What's it like over there? What's the culture like at your company? And sometimes they'll say, oh, it's great. We've got a great PTO, we've got great diversity, I have lots of, learning opportunities and opportunities for advancement and all this great stuff. And that sounds great, right? And sometimes they'll be like, oh man, it's kind of terrible, like, I don't like my boss, and like, we can't get anything shipped, and like, people are always in the way of us getting any kind of success. And other times they'll be like, well, it's fine, but it depends on the department that you're in, or it depends on the team that you're on. Right? Because the culture itself, the centralized culture of the organization, isn't quite strong enough to permeate through absolutely everybody in the entire organization. And that can be troublesome, right? Depending on how things are going. As we've been working in DevOps over the past 15 plus years, right? You know that culture is a big part of that. And if you are in one of these dysfunctional silos that we've been hearing about, you want to change things, it's hard to change things from the bottom up. There are things that we can do, and there'll be some other suggestions that I've got a little bit later as well that will help us have better culture for ourselves and hopefully get to a point where we can permeate that out into parts of the organization that we touch. But organizational culture is often set from the top down. It is set by the leadership. It is set by maybe even the original founders of the organization, especially if they're still alive and still involved. And that's how that gets pushed out, how that gets permeated through the organization. So it's a lot of hard stuff to quantify, hard stuff to qualify as we're thinking about it. And the joke with the fishbowl is, you've got an old fish comes up to some young fish and he says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the young fish are like, "What the hell's water?" Right? They don't even notice it's there. They just know that's what life is. So your culture is very much like that. It's everywhere, but feels like it's nowhere. So rather than going back to 2009, I'm going way back. We're going to get in our history machine here, and we're going back to 1346. Now, I grew up in the United States, so my European history in high school covered the Greeks and the Romans, and ended with the fall of Rome, and picked up again in 1492 with Christopher Columbus. So there's this whole big dark ages in the middle that I had never heard of before. We really didn't study it, right? Because why? Doesn't matter. It's not about America. Who cares? And so the first time I had heard about the Battle of Crécy was actually in an episode of Midsummer Murders, because it's one of those things that Inspector Barnaby is going to be out there trying to solve a murder with an arrow involved, right? So let's go back. So the players here are King Edward III of England. He is nephew of the late King Charles IV of France. Now, the problem with that is that he is the son of the late king's sister, which means he cannot inherit the throne of France. Plus, the English at that time were kind of like the poor country cousins of the Kingdom of France. They're over there, like after the Battle of Hastings in 1066. I learned all that too later. They became vassals, basically, to the French kings. So then the French nobility decides, well, no, Edward can't inherit because he's descended from the female line, and like, even though paternity is a fantasy without DNA testing anyway, we just don't do that. So Philip VI becomes king of France. He's one of the king's cousins. And this is fine for a while, but eventually Edward's like, nah, this doesn't work for me. So he takes out the French Navy as it existed at the time, and then lands a bunch of guys in the northern part of France. So they're basically burning their way from like Calais into the main part of the country. And they come across this nice place called Crécy. There's a hill, and they're like, this is a great place for a battle, and they dig in. And it's in the morning, they get there, and they've got some defensive positions. They've got the high ground, and they basically tuck in. And they're like, we know the French are in the area. We're just going to hang out here and wait for them. And the French eventually make their way into what becomes the plain of battle. And they outnumber the English by like 3 times. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of French infantrymen. And they're expecting pitched battle. They're expecting things to happen the way they have always happened with ground battle in Europe. Now, on the English side, they have a new tool with them, and that tool is the Welsh. Now, the English and the Welsh have been fighting it out in England for quite some time because that's the way they do things. And so as the English have brought the Welsh into their fold, they picked up this thing called the Welsh longbow. Now, the Welsh longbow is what it says on the tin. It's 6 feet long, right? It's very tall. It takes somewhere between 85 and 150 foot-pounds of torque to pull this thing. They're absolutely incredible weapons of war. And the English have brought thousands of them with them into France. The French have never seen them before. So this defensive position that they put up in Crécy, they're basically going to put their longbowmen out, and they're going to rain down arrows on the French. Sounds great, right? And a trained longbowman can pull 6 to 12 arrows a minute. So absolute insanity is coming for the French. And they're like, we have no reason to expect that things are going to be different. And they just march into the plain of battlefield, and they get slaughtered. They have no way of communicating when they see what's happening. There's no radios, right? Philip's like, oh man, we totally should pull back and wait. And the other kings and dukes that are involved, like the King of Bohemia is there. He had no business being there. He's like 50 and blind. And he's the King of Bohemia. What's he even doing there? Bohemia is Czechia. They have no reason to be there. But he's along for the ride. They all get taken out. All the aristocrats are taken out. All the other dukes are killed. Philip's wounded in battle. And they just keep coming. They keep coming because that's what they're expecting to do in the face of vastly changed circumstances. They have no way of reevaluating, no way of stepping back and recalibrating what they're going to do when faced with change. And the English make hay with this. They absolutely decimate the French forces, and they hang out in the northern part of France for the next 100 years. Okay, until the thing that unseated the longbow ends up being gunpowder and muskets and things like that, because the French have no other way of dealing with these things. So absolutely crazy, right? Now, I mention this because it came up in an episode of Cautionary Tales podcast. Does anybody listen to Cautionary Tales? Anybody know who Tim Harford is? He's a British economist, has written a bunch of books, and like he has a whole episode about this. And I have got a link in the end of the notes. But it's basically one of the sort of earliest episodes of thinking about organizational behavior and how you use organizational culture to make decisions when things change around you. Your circumstances have changed. The English are going to shoot all of your aristocrats with these great big tremendous bows, and they're not going to take them hostage, they're not going to hold them for ransom like they used to. They just kill them all. And it completely resets how battle is going to happen during the 100 Years' War between France and England. So, okay, let's come back to the 21st century. Why does this matter? Like, we're not going to be shot in the face by the Welsh anymore, right? They've calmed down a bit since then. But we know that culture is super important. Nathan just told us a bunch of the history of Dora and how culture has been sort of woven into that story as well. McKinsey has done a lot of research on how culture impacts the customers that they have and how things work with the projects that they do. They found that culture correlates with performance. 60% higher returns for the top over the median, 200% over the bottom. Culture is going to move you forward. You're going to have better performance. It's hard to copy. That's the big one. And we know this, right? If we read all these books and you've heard about Zappos culture, or you've heard about the other cultures and people try to replicate them and repeat them and adopt all of these magical practices that are going to spontaneously change your culture, none of that stuff actually happens, right? Culture is very hard to copy. It is built in. It's ingested very early and is part of the actual fiber of the organization. Products and services, on the other hand, easy enough to replicate, but culture definitely is not. We know healthy cultures facilitate adaptability. I know if I'm in a safe place, I have psychological safety in this culture, I can ask questions, I can disagree with the other folks on my team, and we can have a discussion about that. But not all cultures allow that. Change initiatives often fail. There is so much research, documentation, and case studies about change and transformation and all of those the things that sort of come downstream from that. So many of those initiatives just fall flat. And most of that isn't because you've got the wrong tool for the job, it's because your culture is not going to let you do it. But so unhealthy cultures lead to underperformance and ultimately can lead to failure, right? Even if you're not necessarily dying on a battlefield in France. But culture is top of mind. It is a topic that is much discussed. There's a lot of research. I picked just a handful of headlines from HBR from the past couple of years. There's no magic for culture, but people are sort of out there talking about it and trying to give you ways of changing your culture, adding more curiosity to your culture. But it's hard to quantify because it's a set of shared values and often the set then of shared behaviors among lots of people. You can't just read an article and figure it out and get like the amazing change that you need out of it. Culture is going to arise from any and all of the interpersonal relationships that you have in your organization. And if they are positive, if they are generative, which is another word we'll talk about in a minute, then you get more positive outcomes, you have a more positive culture. But it's hard to change. So many of these articles promise to help you build more learning, build more trust, build all these great things into your culture. The hard part about them too is that they're definitely aimed at leaders. Right? I mean, I'm an individual contributor. I read HBR. I understand that I am weird, right? I put my MBA hat on and I tuck in. But not everyone does that. And a lot of that stuff is meant for C-level or VP level folks who are trying to gather up some of this improvement. And it's good that they're curious about it, but the hard work is very hard. So let's talk about some models, right? So Edgar Schein he was a psychologist and a professor. He did a lot of the foundational research in what we now call organizational behavior, right? And he did a lot of this work he started in the 1960s, did a lot of his big publishing in the 1980s, but you gotta figure, like, this is all post-industrial, right? Organizations of the size that we're encountering now only existed maybe in the military prior to industrialization. Small master carpenters with a couple of apprentices, the organizational culture there is derived by how that dude treats the teenagers that live in his house, right? So organizational culture is downstream of building these large organizations. So he has 3 levels that he has divided the components of culture into. The basic assumptions that make up your culture are there at the bottom. They are formed over time as team members work together, as they interpret behaviors when they encounter each other. They might include events and activities, the kinds of things that we do. Oh, our culture has a change review board as part of it. Those kinds of things. They're deeply embedded. They're often taken for granted, but they're the main part of the water that the team is all swimming in. So they don't even necessarily recognize when the culture is like, doesn't feel right. If you read some of the like work advice columns, I read Ask a Manager, she's hysterical, and sometimes she has letters from people who are like, am I crazy? Is this bad? Because the folks don't have enough frame of reference to understand that the cultures that they're in are toxic. And there's a lot of that goes along. So there's going to be a lot of folks who have been at the organization for a very long time and don't even notice like the way the culture sort of behaves. And sometimes it takes like a new person coming in to like recognize, oh, this culture is a little bit different. So like I joined PagerDuty 4 years ago. I had been at Chef for 8.5 years. And if you ever saw any of our talks when we were at Chef was a very sweary culture. Like there was a lot of swearing going on. And Ethan's nodding. Like it was your fault. But like we did a lot of swearing at PagerDuty or at Chef, and PagerDuty does not. It's super Canadian that way, right? Like there's no swearing going on. I'm like, can I talk about postmortems and drop an F-bomb? I'm not sure. So like I don't swear so much in my talks because it's not the same culture. And when I talk to the folks that've been at PagerDuty for a long time, they're like, oh, I didn't even really notice. Like, yeah, because you didn't come from Chef where everything was and whatever. So yeah, some of those things you don't even notice, but they're everywhere. Then in the middle layer, you've got your values, and these are your stated values of the organization. It's how it talks about itself. It's public statements that it makes. These are visible things, right? Some of them are probably aspirational, right? Because you want to be all you can be, but maybe it doesn't exactly work that way. But there are often aspects of the organization that we associate with the word culture. Commitments to PTO, commitments to work-life balance, commitments to the environment, like the triple bottom line, all that kind of stuff that gets published for the benefit of stockholders and things like that. And then the most visible level of culture are the artifacts at the top. And this can be all kinds of stuff, right? They're going to be easily recognized by people outside of the organization, so they can be advertising, right? They can be, mission statements, and formal procedures, all that kind of stuff. Maybe even a dress code. Does anybody work at Target? Like Target, if you work at the headquarters, it's business, or you can dress in the Target associates from the stores in khakis and a red shirt. So they permeate that throughout their culture. Like that's super important. Walmart was kind of notorious for a long time for having a song, right? IBM used to have a song in the 50s too. Like all that stuff kind of rolls up into this artifacts part of culture. And that impacts how folks associate with each other. It impacts what they use as their scaffolding and framework when they make decisions, and what they do, how they react when they are faced with a new circumstance that they haven't seen before. How are they going to approach it based on their assumptions, values, and the artifacts of their culture? So that's at the macro level. And another thing that Sheen discusses is because every person, human beings, have a lot of different associations, they have different kinds of cultures that they can be part of, right? I grew up in the United States. I have some sort of American culture. I happen to have lived most of my life on the East Coast, so I'm not passive-aggressive like y'all are out here on the West Coast, right? You think I'm super aggressive, right, because I'm from the East Coast, and that's how that goes. I'm not from New York, but still more direct than other folks are in other parts of the country. And one thing Sheen points out is that not only do we have these sort of divisions of other cultures that we belong to, but there's also, it's worth noting that certain occupations also have a distinct culture. Now, he had talked mostly, he uses the example of chemists, right? So chemistry, if you are doing things with pipettes and titration and picnometers and like all this stuff to 5 degrees of specificity or whatever, like there's a certain culture that you have for how you put those experiments together, how you do the measurements, how you publish the results. And chemists at, say, Eli Lilly and chemists at Novartis are probably more similar to each other than they are to other employees of those organizations. So they have sort of a microculture, remember that one, inside of the organization. And that happens to us, I feel, as well, right? As we've been struggling from the bottom, like banging up, come on, man, we need to change the culture from the bottom. But we have our own culture now that we're able to influence more directly. Now, the guy on the right-hand side here, I don't know what he's working on, but I know his rightmost monitor is an IDE. I can't see what the code is, I don't know what he's doing, but I have a pretty good feeling I know at least part of how he's working and what he's doing. And that becomes part of then the culture of being a software developer. Here's your IDE, we can make some educated guesses about the workflow and how things are being put together. So in some ways, it's part of the sort of professionalization of a particular job type or occupation that gives those folks the ability to identify the set of characteristics as being associated with the job that they do. It also gives some of the rest of us, a picture in our mind about, the generic software engineer or generic nurse or lawyer or auto mechanic or whoever it happens to be, right? So it allows us to group together the aspects of this particular occupation and use that as a basis for what to do when we're faced with challenges and new circumstances. So hopefully you've seen this particular model before. There's lots of models to describe culture. Some of them are very complicated. This one is very uncomplicated, which is why I like it and keep referring back to it. The good part about this too is the original paper is only about 15 pages long. So you can absolutely read through this. It's very easy to understand. The interesting part was that while this feels like, oh man, this speaks to me as a technologist, the environments he was studying were in healthcare. And you'll see this a lot in cultural research. The parallels between, especially healthcare and technology, are very apparent. That it becomes, there's a lot of stickiness there between healthcare and the way technology runs. So the Western model is one model that's particularly helpful, I think, for folks at all levels. The earlier stuff was very much leadership driven, top down, but some of the things that you can look at from the Western model and gain from it are things that individual contributors can help participate in, right? It's sort of, and it's sort of like the equalizer on an old school stereo, right? You can push the bass the whole way up. You don't have to be in the same column for all of these things, but they give you a place to move your slider or thinking about moving your slider as you're working with things. So there are a lot of things that individuals, like I said, can do versus sort of large top-down cultural initiatives. You and your team really can foster more cooperation with other teams in your org, right? You can help mitigate some risks. You can help bridge with other parts of the organization. And you can implement all those things at micro levels rather than waiting for the organization to join up with all of these things. So it's an interesting one. If you have not read that paper, I absolutely encourage that you find it. It's at the National Library of Medicine. I think there's a PDF there. I have the link at the end for that one. So if we want to focus on influence, there's a number of things that we can look at. Because tech is very much outcome-based, we are shipping code into production and we want the customers to love it, right? The culture then is judged by the employees at how well are they able to actually get that done? How well are they able to get the code that they have put into production? So we have a lot of resources and tools to help us deal with all of this kind of stuff, right? It helps us diagnose and remedy all the stumbling blocks and all the impediments that we have in our organization. We can do some value stream mapping. We can look at flow. We have all these good things. But the slow-moving ship of culture means that we're going to find folks in our organization who identify with like version 1.0 of the culture, right? They're not really ready to change, right? And there's folks who are going to stand in the way of like every decision just because they can, right? Even if it means running outdated versions of software, right? Like there's some dude in the corner who's like, no man, we absolutely cannot get rid of that CentOS 7 box. And you're like, look dude, we're gonna get hacked and this is all on you. And he's like, I'm Teflon, I don't care. But they're out there. So another model that I often use for folks, and this is another one going back to, I think this got published in 2011 on the Chef blog. This is John Willis's CAMS model. He also added lean to this later, so it became CALMS. But the parts of it that sort of break down is the C in culture. Because when we're looking at what individual contributor technologists especially, what we can influence, what we can have part of the decision-making process, are the other things in this particular mnemonic. Automation, right? I got some bash scripts. I'm going to share them with the guy next door. We're going to automate so much of this stuff. It's going to be awesome, right? We've got metrics. Like, we're on board with whatever metrics the CTO has decided we're going to use, and here's how we're going to put them together for our benefit. Tooling derived. Sharing as well. We'll put stuff in the wiki. We're going to publish stuff on Slack. We're going to hold brown bags on Friday, right, to share what our learnings are. We're posting post-incident reviews for the customers to read. All of these things are very individual contributor enabled, right? Everybody can do these without a big initiative. Often you can do them without spending a lot of money as well, right? You don't necessarily need a brand new tool for all of them, although it's great when you get one. You don't always have to have one. So where this sort of drives down is that there's a lot of more recent research, and like from the 90s and up, about microcultures. They're very influential, especially in professional settings, right? Like we talked about before with the chemists, there's a lot of microcultures that have emerged around the professionalization of various technology jobs. But interestingly enough, some of the first research that was done here was about online communities. So the earliest community is sort of post-Usenet, right? Because Usenet was sort of its thing, but it's a lot more asynchronous. But when you get into something like, say, some of the early research on Slashdot, of all places, right? Raise your hand for 3 or 4-digit user ID on Slashdot. My people. And Cowboy Neil, right? So they're opt-in, and that's super important, right? These are organizations that are self-organizing. These are communities where people opt in and join up because they want to, not because they're forced to, because of their job, or because of the school that they go to, or because of the city they live in. These are cultures that are completely created and sort of artificial in that way, so that the folks that are in there have all chosen to be there. And that's very powerful. So there's some interesting stuff coming out as this research continues and continues to emerge about how microcultures then sort of live and even survive within larger organizations, right? A lot of interesting things there. So that's where we're headed, right? Is like trying to figure out how you exist in the water if the water isn't perfect for you, right? How do we use our influence to change the things that we can change, adjust the things that we can touch within our workflows, within the way that our team functions, thinking back to even the basics here with automation, metrics, and sharing, thinking to the more complex things that the Westrum model sort of gives us as tools for sort of giving ourselves a bit of grace inside these microcultures that are having a hard time in the larger organizational structures. So there's still a lot of challenge there. There is a lot of research being done, which is the good part about it. The bad part is that most of us are going to be retired by the time any of this becomes sort of established practice. So we think back to 1346, and the French are being faced with the longbow. It was 100 years before things changed enough during the 100 Years' War for them to sort of figure out what they were going to do with those particular weapons and had a solution to face them. So, in summary, culture is part of how your organization approaches problems. It is the scaffolding that people hold on to when they are trying to answer questions, when they are faced with new circumstances. That is how they make choices, how they make decisions. It exists as human connections. The connections you have to your team, the connections you have across teams, the connection your team as a whole has to other places. Culture can be improved, but it's very, very hard to do across the entire organization. A lot of those things fail. And one bonus thing to learn, don't engage the Welsh in battle. There's my little friend down there with a longbow, and he's a pretty dangerous guy. So here's some resources for you. As I mentioned, cautionary tales. The title of the episode is The French Knight's Guide to Corporate Culture, right, which is beautiful. So if you're into podcasts, take a look at that one. And then Edgar Sheen had founded the Organizational Culture and Leadership Institute. He sadly passed away last year, but his son is maintaining all of the content there. So there's plenty of things there as well. And then Westrum's model is also there, and some other pieces that I use. So I'm not sure how we're doing on time since technology had its way with us, but if we have a minute, I can answer some questions or